Okay, shall we go then for it? Okay. Okay, so I'm going to just turn on the clock so I don't lose track of time. So welcome all to this webinar on disentangling anxiety that I've called The Good, the Bad, and the Others. Hopefully that may recall some ancient movies I'm going to touch upon later on. So before we start, I think it was important for me to tell you who is talking. So yes, my name is Beatriz Seisdedos, as very well was pronounced by Christoph. For those who don't speak Spanish, my surname means 6 fingers, which is not very practical and quite annoying when you're 12, but very useful when you're an ICRC delegate in Colombia and everyone wants to meet you just because they're curious about your name. So that's me. So yes, I was a humanitarian worker. I worked for the Red Cross movement for 15 years. I think this is most of what is left. I don't know if you can see the mug, but sorry, this. And so I started with the Spanish Red Cross, and then I worked in the headquarters, and I moved into the field. Then I moved with the ICRC. And while I was working in the field, I decided, okay, let's go and take some use of those beautiful curfews we have sometimes, and I'm going to start studying psychology as a hobby. And the hobby became more and more interesting for me, and it became the gateway, the exit somehow of the humanitarian field when I felt that was it for me. And I moved to the UK to train. I finished my training there, and then I trained as a cognitive behavioral therapist in the UK. And now I have my private practice in Spain. I work mainly online with clients from very different places. I would say a high percentage of them are former or current humanitarian workers. But I only wanted to mention this, to give you an idea that I have a little idea of where you are and what's going on when you work in the humanitarian field. In fact, I have to say, Regina, my last mission was Herat, so I know where you are. But the reason why, that's not the main reason that I wanted to do this presentation. What I wanted to call your attention on is the last sentence. What I am now is I am a former and a current anxious person. And why did I write that? When they told me about talking about anxiety, do a webinar about it. Anxiety, you have books, endless books and things like that. Because I'm thinking, how am I going to choose what to say in an hour? And then I thought, okay, first of all, I think maybe I have to concentrate on what I would have liked to hear when I was out there. What is something it have been useful for me 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, before I started to know more about anxiety. And secondly, I thought, okay, what are the things that are not so much in YouTube anymore? Like things that people have access so easily, or tech talks that, could be useful for you. So I've tried to come to something that hopefully is useful for you. And it's a bit different than when you normally when you talk about anxiety. And so the difference why I was a former anxious person and a current anxious person, it's because I deal with anxiety differently now. And one of the tipping points for me was to start to understand that emotions are sending a message. A lot of people that come to my practice, they come and they say, oh, I really want to get rid of my anxiety. I want to control my anxiety. I want this anxiety to disappear. And I tell them, I'm really sorry, it's not going to be possible. I'm sorry, look for someone else. Or consider that the reason why it's not possible is because emotions are a primitive way of all human beings to understand that something's going on. It's like our alert system, our most primitive way of telling us something is going on. So we cannot switch them off. In fact, if we switch them off, we switch them off, all of them. Happiness, sadness, all together. So, for example, I'll give you an example, anger, so anger, a lot of people tell me, I want to get rid of my anger. Probably you want to get rid of the behaviors that are very much linked to anger outburst, but I'm not really sure you want to get rid of anger, because anger is a basic emotion that is there to tell us that someone is trespassing our limits. So that when that happens, we get defensive, Anger normally activates our bodies, right? And we want to kind of do something about it. We want to fight whatever, when we're angry, we really want to fight normally or run away. But in general terms, it's fighting. So we need that drive to kind of confront whatever is that thing that is trespassing, that is abusing our limits. So we need it. We need anger somehow. Same thing with sadness. Sometimes people tell me, wow, sadness, how can that be useful? Well, sadness is actually telling us that something is hurting us. So we need to retrieve somehow. We need to cocoon a little bit in ourselves. That's what normally happens when we are sad. We just need time for ourselves and reflect on how can we overcome this. We need that space. And that's what sadness is doing. And anxiety is not different. So basically, the objective of this talk, and I'm alerting you in case you decide this is not what it is for you, is that you continue to be anxious. I would like you all to continue to be anxious, but what I'm going to try to do is to help you to somehow find a balance. So take the good side of anxiety and try to maneuver a little bit better that negative side of anxiety. Now, to do that, first of all, we need to describe what anxiety is. And I'm saying this because my former anxious person didn't know what this was. So I didn't know I was anxious, even though I knew something was going on. So this definition is not mine. It's by the American Psychology Society. And it's the anticipation of a future threat. Okay. Now, if we're anticipating, we are thinking of potential scenarios that could happen. Okay. They are not in front of us. They are going to happen in the future. They are not here. They are in the future. And they normally take the form what? What if? So what if I lose my job? What if I don't pass this interview? What if my parents get sick? What if I don't find an exit to the ICRC or to the humanitarian world? What if? If you can see, all of those tend to be the most kind of terrifying or catastrophizing thing that could happen. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm saying that we are imagining and we're focusing normally on somehow the worst scenario. And that's why it's threatening. And that's why we have physical reactions that are very similar to fear. So because we're thinking, we're worrying. I'll give you an example. I've got a phone call, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago, 6 years ago, of someone. This was someone not in the field. And she was really, really anxious. And she was saying to me, I'm really anxious because I'm thinking about the following situation. So my parents are getting older. My brother and sister, they live relatively far away from my parents, and I will be the one taking care of my parents. I live already relatively far, 2 hours, 3 hours away. And it's going to be me taking care of them. And if they may end up in a home, this means I will have to split my family life with my parents, and I'm really, really anxious. And that's when I was starting my training. I said, okay, let's go for the therapy side of myself. And I'm going to start asking you, okay, so fine. May I ask you, so are your parents sick? Oh, no, they're perfectly fine. They're really active. They travel a lot, and there's no been any diagnosis of anything. Okay, so your parents are not sick. No? Okay. Do you know whether your brother and sister have plans to stay or where they are, or are they going to move? You know, is there any possibility that they move? Well, I never think about this. Well, I don't know. Yeah, well, my brother works in hospitality, so maybe yes, he would move. Okay, so he could move closer to your parents. Yeah, maybe yes. Okay. And finally, have you considered that unfortunate as it is, that your parents might die from a sudden death? And that just questioning, just that additional alternative made the anxiety go down, because she was just concentrating on that very terrible side, you know, terrible, threatening, you know, idea that this was going to happen. And there was no space for other alternatives. And that's what sometimes worry and anxiety takes us. But, you know, I mean, there's a good side of anxiety. And I'm sorry I put this, but as I mentioned to you, I thought of this movie. And so when I was thinking of this webinar, I thought, okay, well, I thought of this, and then I thought of this. I don't know if you can hear it. So I think, well, so I thought, okay, well, what is the good side? Why do we hook to anxiety? Why is beneficial? What is the usefulness of anxiety? And it's not something I'm inventing. There's been studies about this. And they've identified 5 main reasons why anxiety is useful. I've chosen these 3 because I think they are the most common ones. So I'm going to concentrate only on these 3 because I think they are the ones that most commonly come to the private practice and most commonly happens with people that are in the field. The first one is preparedness. I think it's quite relevant, this one, you know, like what was this lady doing when she was calling me? She was trying to get ready to prepare herself for whatever it was going to come. She was probably even checking for homes where she could take her parents, or to hospitals, you know. She was trying to prepare herself for whatever it was going to come. And that's what we do with anxiety. I think the most representative example of this are evacuation plans. For those working in Afghanistan, you know what I'm talking about. So we have to contemplate the worst scenario in order to prepare ourselves for that contingency. The same thing if I have a friend who is a very anxious person as well. She works in aviation and she's hooked to her anxiety because she's paid to be anxious, because she's the one doing the quality checks for the planes. Obviously, you want someone like that to take care of the quality checks of the planes. So she's hooked into her anxiety because she's paid to be anxious. The second one is motivation. This one is very common, and we talked about it later a bit more, but sometimes we need a little level of anxiety to get motivated. I need to be anxious to be motivated. Let's think about reports, you know. If you know that your report is not going to be read, it's not relevant, no one is going to care, it is very likely that you would not be really motivated, and you don't have a deadline. That's a very important thing. So you probably will not write it or not put much of an effort to write it. And the minute you have a deadline, the minute you know someone is going to read it and someone is going to take decisions up with that report, for example, you start to get anxious because you start thinking of all those what if, you know. What if my boss read it? What if he asks me questions? What ifs, right? So it's a drive. And the third one, I think some people kind of look at me bizarrely when I say this, but it's quite like, if I have to tell you who is kind of like the biggest representative of worrying is caring, if I can put it that way, or being anxious is caring, are mothers. So mothers, think of the typical example of a mother that is calling, that is asking you, where are you going? What are you doing? Blah, 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 blah. You know, this person is probably worrying. This is the questions are derived because this person is worried and she wants to know that she worries. In fact, if your mother wouldn't care, you know, wouldn't be asking these questions, sometimes people get scared, like, why is my mom not asking me? Why is my mother not worrying? And you start questioning, is she not caring for me anymore, you know? So the reason why I've chose this is because, okay, we're talking about mothers, but I've seen this very often in the field. The reason why we're in the field is because we care. We are worrying about victims, beneficiaries, situations, the impact of whatever is happening. So we care. And because we care, we worry. But it's striking that balance that we might need to think about. Okay. So what is the bad side of anxiety? Because up to here, we've seen, you know, we've seen that they are very practical, right? So the bad side of anxiety is the excess of all the things that I've described before. When we take it beyond, you know, the limits, when it's too much. Now, there are two things, two ways somehow that are showing that we are kind of overpassing the tipping point, right? And I promise you, I wanted to have a picture of a land cruiser, and I spent really a lot of time looking for a land cruiser because I thought it was much more adequate for this presentation, but I guess the land cruisers are too big to fill them that way, so I couldn't find it. So I had to stay with my old picture. So what do we do when, you know, when we want to prepare, when we want to be motivated? Sometimes we over prepare ourselves. And this is the one linked to uncertainty, wanted to control uncertainty, wanted control in general, because anxiety and the need to are really lovers. And somehow a lot of people that are anxious are what we call allergic to uncertainty. And it's funny, I'm saying this to people who are living in Afghanistan, you know, I mean, you cannot think of a more uncertain space. Well, Sudan right now, maybe, but it's still, I'll come to more details of what I mean by over-preparing. But imagine this person wants to go for a picnic. I guess if you look at this car and you know that this person is going for an afternoon picnic, you start thinking, okay, well, maybe you're overdoing this a little bit, aren't you? Well, this is kind of an exaggeration, but we do this sometimes when we are anxious because we want to gain control. And what do we do? So the over-preparing normally reflects in difficulties to stop overworking. So I'm not even saying overworking because, I mean, overworking is kind of in the nature of the job. It's difficulties to stop it, okay? And sometimes, how is this, I mean, what is the reflection? How does this crystallize? Spending too much time in tasks. Sometimes, for example, reading an email, sometimes that you read it 2-3 times to make sure that you are actually, you know, that you, by the way, I'm stopping here, but sometimes if you're not, it's very helpful for me because I know I'm going into the right direction. So thank you for that. So spending too much time in tasks that maybe not, that are not very relevant as times, but sometimes I'll give you an example. This is an exaggeration, and I think I've never found something like this ever before either. I had a client who took around an hour and a half to write each email she wanted to write her boss, because she wanted to make sure that the email was correct and her first language was not English. So he would write it first, then she would put it into a translator, Then she would put it into a second translator. I'm talking about the internet translators, right? To make sure that the first one had done the job properly. And then this final version of it was double-checked with a grammar program. And finally, she would read the message and send it. So can you imagine how many emails she could, imagine how many emails you send a day, or if you're working, how many emails you send to your boss, and how much time she was spending just on addressing emails. So obviously she was overworking because she had later on to do, the job that she hadn't been doing. So that's the difficulty to prioritize as well, Scanning for missing things. Again, for example, you're going for a field trip, you have to scan, you have to make sure you have certain things, like this person going for a picnic. But sometimes it's a bit of a scanning and re-scanning and looking for missing things that maybe they're not missing anymore. And you somehow know, but you still go on and go on and go on. Rumination. I will not concentrate too much on this one now, because I'll come back to it, okay? But rumination is, for some people ask me what it means just thinking constantly about the same things all over again, okay? Difficulties to delegate, there's a star, because you want to gain control. The more anxious you are, the more you need to gain control, the less capacities you've got sometimes to delegate. And then you extend that to your personal life. So whatever is happening maybe in your job, or whatever the situation that is creating the anxiety, then you extend it to checking things, writing emails, I don't know, whatever it is, but you bring it a bit onto your personal life. So doing these things basically generate a little bit more anxiety. And because you're anxious, you keep on doing these things. And because you do these things, you feel anxious. And we are in a cycle that is very difficult to break. Okay. Now, second behavior that is very typical when we feel anxious, that is a star, avoidance. And I have to say, most of the people that come to sessions with me and they come because of their anxiety, this is the behavior they identified easily, right? The first one, they're not so sure about, but this one is clear. So what does it mean, avoidance? Avoidance is not doing. Avoidance can be avoiding even people, okay? But the queen of not doing in our field of work, I have to say, my experience is procrastination, this famous word of doing everything else that you have to do instead of the task that you really have to do because you're anxious. Many times it's because you're anxious, you're not going to do the task as you would like it to be done. But that's, I'm going to leave it because that enters into the world of perfectionism, and I'm going to have a little space for that, okay? Now, other things that we might be doing that are led by anxiety, and we didn't know it was anxiety that it was leading them, are the scrolling on the phones or the social media. This, I have to say, is a growing phenomenon. This one with the binge series is a growing phenomenon. So I have people spending hours on end just sitting down on a phone, doing nothing at the end of the day, like, just checking social media. I have to say, doing nothing, I put it on, a bit of question mark, because sometimes that they are doing might also generate anxiety. If you're checking, depending on what checking, you start questioning yourself, but I'm not going to enter there either. But yeah, the scrolling on the phone. I'll give you another example. I had another client who was checking YouTube videos of cats doing funny things. And she could spend 2 hours in her day just checking cats doing funny things. I didn't even know YouTube could offer 2 hours of cats doing funny things on, like that. But she was just, somehow wasting her time, and she knew she was. So she felt anxious about it, but she couldn't help it because it was a way to kind of soothe herself. Binge eating, I was hesitating about the binge eating because I'm not really sure that in some of the locations you can binge eat because there's not much you can have that is helping you to soothe. That in some places binge eating is, I mean chocolate, chips, I'm talking about greasy things, okay? But the binge series, that's another thing that I found really common in the field. And in my times, Netflix did not exist. We were used to travel with these hard drives with thousands and thousands of hours of series and movies and things like that. And I remember people sitting down for, free entire, a full entire day off they got just watching series as a way to calm down the anxiety, as a way to zoom out, okay? And spending too much time in unnecessary tasks, I think that's somehow the same thing as procrastination. So again, what I've mentioned is because you are procrastinating, you're doing this, you feel anxious, because you feel anxious, you do that, and then you get in that cycle of anxiety. I think it's important for me to kind of remark what are behaviors linked to anxiety, because that's what sometimes can help us to kind of, okay, wait, I'm feeling anxious, let's, the idea is identify your anxiety somehow as well, Now, I wanted to use this because it's kind of a summary of what we've seen. This is a summary of the good and the bad, particularly on the motivation side. I don't know if you've ever seen this curve before, right? Some of you said yes, okay. So it's a curve on a stress, and I'm going to talk briefly later on the difference between stress and anxiety, but in this case, I think it's anyway useful because it's similar, they work very similar, So that's what we were mentioned, if you are in the green side or in the bottom lower part of the green side, if you're not anxious, you're not active, you're not motivated, you don't produce, you don't perform, right? You need some levels of stress and anxiety to start performing, right? And then you go up, 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 because you need that level of stress and anxiety to perform to the utmost of what you can do. So that is somehow the good side. That's the one we want, right? We want to be motivated, we want to perform, we want to be active. That's why we are out there, most of us, we're there to show that we care, that we're doing, and we perform. Now, what happens is that sometimes we do not realize that we are tipping into the orange and the red side. And we are giving for granted things, we are somehow alluding to think that we are tired, or that's not important if I'm tired, I have to be there and we need to keep on going and keep on going. And I know this is not the source of the talk today, but I cannot say and talk about burnt out, burnt out is kind of like the ghost of field workers, I think, the ghost of humanitarian workers, because we've talked about it a lot, and sometimes you don't realize what it is until you're really there. And getting out of there is quite difficult. And everyone thinks that most of the people that get there previously think they will never get there. And then when they are there, they thought, why didn't I act before? So I think it's really important to remark that with anxiety is the same thing. Are you overdoing? Are you over preparing? Are you over avoiding? Because that's giving us signs of what's going on. Okay. Now, what do I do then? I think maybe that's where everyone wants to get somehow, right? We have to try to balance both sides. I have to say that this webinar talking about anxiety is not introducing relaxation techniques, grounding techniques, breathing techniques, and not because they are not relevant. It is mainly because I think they're very accessible. I think they're the first techniques that people are shown. I think there's a lot of YouTube videos, a lot of materials about breathing, relaxing music. I mean, endless materials about this, and not so much of what I'm talking today. So I left that aside, but it doesn't mean I don't think it's relevant. Okay, I just wanted to make that little remark. And I know they're not very useful sometimes when the levels of anxiety are really high, but I think they're complementary anyway to what we are doing today. Okay. So remember what we said, right? There were 3 reasons why we keep on being anxious: preparedness, motivation, caring. So what I would like to do now is that we start considering in which side are we, like, please analyze your anxiety. Please, when you feel anxious, think, what am I doing? What is the usefulness of what I am doing? And I'm overdoing it. And that's basically what I would like to propose to you. So we're going to challenge positive beliefs about anxiety. It's not, I wrote here the 2 authors that kind of developed this idea. So basically, the idea is that we hooked into anxiety because we think worrying helps to find solution to problems, right? And that's really interesting because it's true. Sometimes that's what we were saying, if we don't worry about evacuation plans, we don't have solutions to whatever it could be the problems that we face, right? If we don't think about all the needs in a distribution, then maybe we have a lot of troubles while we're doing the distribution, right? Now, the question I have here for you to start trying to see if you can ask yourself is, are you finding solutions or replaying the same ones all the time? What do I mean? A lot of people that are anxious, for example, anxious about an interview, a job interview, they go and they think of the interview and they think about how the questions that they're going to have and how anxious they're going to get. And what if they ask me this question? And what if I don't answer properly? And then the movie stops there and then they go back. What if they ask me these questions? What if I don't answer? What if I get nervous? What if ends and restarts all over again? It's the same movie somehow. So the person is not finding solutions. It's just replaying the same solutions, even if you have the solution. Sometimes you just replay the same solution all over again. So if this is what is happening, anxiety is triggering, and the bad side of anxiety is triggering. That's when you probably need to start considering, okay, relaxation techniques, distractions, we'll look at it later on. Second one we mentioned, motivation, okay? So being anxious helps motivations, it ensures things are done. True, but is your anxiety making you functional, or is it affecting your real performance? Back to here. Are we talking about this? Are you motivated and doing things? Or are you overdoing, reading messages, rechecking things? Is this really somehow the performance you would like to have? Third one. Worrying is a positive personality trait. If I worry, I care. So this is probably, well, the sample of the mothers, probably what the lady that called me on the phone about her parents was doing as well. She was showing care for her parents, probably care for her family as well. But the question is your anxiety and worry really showing that you care? Or is it something else that shows it? I'm going to take the example of the mother and I'll bring it later to it. So do you really think your mother needs to make all those phone calls to show you that she loves you? Or you know that she loves you for other things that she does? Is it reading emails, writing reports, responding to messages while you are on your R&R and holidays, really showing that you care? Or are other ways that you show that you care? So additionally, will your beneficiaries know that you are doing this on your R&R? And is it going to make such a big change in their lives? I'm not really sure, but maybe not answering those messages, phone calls, whatever, it's going to make the change that you need at that time. But it's the anxiety that is keeping you on that computer or on that phone, most likely. It was for me anyway. Now, I hesitated about showing you this, guys, because it's a bit different from what we've been talking about right now. I mean, it's complementary, let's say. But the reason why I decided to put it in is because I had a couple of people I worked with that they found it really useful. And I said, okay, I'm going to add it. Because somehow, sometimes the key questions that you have to ask yourselves as well is, first of all, is notice that you're worrying, and then separate worries or problems, whatever you want to call them, into hypothetical or current. What do I mean? Is the problem in front of you? Or is this these what ifs that we were talking about? Is it what if my father gets sick? What if I don't get a job? What if I don't find another degree? Is it another way, to deal with this problem, another way out of the ICRC? Or I don't know, what if my family gets affected by whatever happens? Is it hypothetical? Are you having the problem now? Or are you having the problem in your mind? So is it current or hypothetical? Now, if it's hypothetical, and I know some people will kind of raise their hands about this, let me finish with this, okay? Let the worry go. And this is where I told you know these things a bit better than me, what works for you, because how you help yourself to let your worries go, it depends. It really, I don't feel comfortable to tell you do this or that, because every one of you knows how to do it. To change the focus of attention, distraction techniques, whatever helps you to kind of leave them aside. Now, is the problem current? Then ask yourself, can I do something about it now? If the answer is yes, then do it and let the worry go. If the answer is no, well, let the worry go. If the answer is I can do some, the question is, can I do something about it later? If the question is yes, schedule when you're going to solve the problem and let the worry go. And if it's no, let the worry go. Now, as I mentioned to you, some people find this very useful. Some others come and tell me, okay, but I need to worry about the hypothetical problems, okay? This is a tricky thing, but I decided to enter a little line here, okay? And I decided to do that, especially when COVID happened. When COVID happened, I was in the UK. I was working with a charity, a mental health charity, and obviously a lot of people were dealing with a lot of anxiety and a lot of hypothetical questions. So what when I was saying to you the difference between the former and the current anxious person I was, I applied this to my personal situation. So I was living in the UK. I had 2 small children. My husband was a nurse in the hospital. So I could have had a lot of worries, but my worries, my catastrophic thinking was not my husband is going to die or I'm going to die, or my worries were if I end up in the hospital, who's going to take care of my children? That was my worry. So I could have replayed the question, who's going to take care of my children, and think about all the bad things that my children could go through, like if social services, I don't know, whatever. I could have hooked to that, but I said, okay, I'm going to apply the worry tree, and I'm going to prepare my evacuation plan. So I contact a friend, and I ask her, okay, can you please take care of them? And I know this is a simplifying example, okay, but just to give you an idea, I said, okay, can you take, if I go to the hospital, can you take care of my children? Can you please contact this, and I gave her a plan, basically. And she says, yes, no worries. End of my anxiety in this regard. I'm not saying it's radical, but I say maybe it's useful. Think about, okay, if you want to hook on your hypothetical problems, hook on the solutions of those problems, not so much on the problems themselves. Christoph, I think there is a Natalie that wants to enter. I don't know if I can let her in. Can you let her in? Cannot hear you.
Yeah, I just said I did let her in, and welcome, Natalie.
Okay. Okay, so I know it's difficult sometimes, and that's why I hesitated. Some people tell me, letting worry go is not easy. I know this very well. And again, it really depends on the situation and your own ways of dealing with it. But sometimes we have to think about embracing anxiety. Sometimes we have to accept we are anxious. We have to tell ourselves, you know what? You're anxious. You have reasons to be anxious. And today you're not going to probably sleep very well. That's what it is. Because sometimes what happens is that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves of not feeling anxious. I shouldn't be feeling anxious, or I am feeling anxious, or that the anxiety in itself is kind of creating more anxiety. And the idea of putting pressure on ourselves, on, I have to deal with this, I should be sleeping. The sleeping is the very best case. And I think, the very best example. You are sleeping and you go, oh, I have to sleep because if not tomorrow, I'm going to be very tired. And if I am really tired, I will not be performing as the way I want. And if I don't perform the way I want, then it's going to mean I'm going to make a lot of mistakes and I'm going to feel really, really tired. And then you go thinking this, and obviously, I don't know for you, but for me, this is not very conducive to go to sleep. So then you keep on going. And how can you not relax? There's this type of dialogues that we can have sometimes with our own selves, and that keeps it hooks. I mean, they keeps us into the cycle of anxiety. Okay. So now we are coming to the others. So the other side, or the additional side. I have to say, anxiety rarely comes alone. Rarely. Generally, it's very much combined with one of these two things, perfectionism or low self-esteem. I don't mean that both happen at the same time. But it's not uncommon that I find this in the people I talk to. Now, it's very important for me that I define perfectionism, because when I mention to people that, they come to me and I start seeing them and talking to them and say, would you consider you could have some traits of perfectionism? They go, no, me? No, I'm a disorder. I'm really not. I don't want things to be perfect. Okay, right. Let's define things. It's not about doing things perfect. It's about doing them the best way. I mean, the under your standards, under the standards of what you consider good enough. I'll give you an example. I always use this example, poor man, but I was working with someone, and I promised you the British Library would have paid for his skills to tie up the books. I mean, I know they were in alphabetical order and inside, and he was talking to me and saying to me, and I could see it in the background, He was like, no, I'm not a perfectionist. You should ask my wife. And I'm like, okay, well, how I'm going to tell him turn around and check your books, because maybe that's what's going to show you actually, I mean, who you truly are, somehow. So I mean, he was at extreme, but I think there are a lot of traits of perfectionism in many of us. I think if there wouldn't be, we might not be feeling that anxious about the injustice in the world. And most of us are really good performers, really people are, I mean, you have to go through a lot of studies, you have to speak languages, you have to really, I mean, okay, there can be casting errors, but in general, people are really trained to get to where we are, to get to work in the humanitarian field. And this is normally, we get there because we have a certain trait of perfectionism. We want to do well. And we put those standards on ourselves. Now, obviously, we want those standards, and we are working in an environment in which those standards are rarely possible. Like I remember doing distributions, and I want things to be really, like people in line and doing the distribution and, package and not losing anything on the way. And well, let me tell you, my first distribution was like, okay, I think I need to reconsider this again, because and then internet connections, electricity cuts, X, Y, Z. I mean, namely, you can name it. So those are challenging your perfectionist standards, and therefore that creates certain anxiety because you want things done in a certain way. Now, the low self-esteem, anyway, perfectionism is just an introduction of it, but I think it's really relevant to have it in place, and I'll mention it slightly later on. Low self-esteem, it's very much anxiety is sometimes related to how we feel as well, that we can handle things, if we're not very sure about, if you are thinking about catastrophic scenarios, really the bad ones, sometimes they are bad because you are afraid of how you're going to deal with them. And I don't mean that because you are afraid you have low self-esteem. But what I mean is the more your self-esteem is not really at the top, the more you're going to feel anxious, or the more you're going to be prone to anxiety, let's put it this way. But again, that's another chapter, I think, a full chapter, in fact, because, yeah. So now I wanted also to make give a little bit of time and have a little bit of spare time. So I'm going to distinguish between the idea of anxiety and stress. And some people might argue with me that they are very much related and it's very difficult to separate them. And it's true, I mean, it generally is very difficult to find pure things. But I thought it was relevant here to make this distinction, because if we take them purely, stress is related to external demands. If your boss is, it's really putting a lot of pressure on you, you have a lot of pressure on writing reports, doing this, doing that, and then you have a phone call from another place, and then you have to receive the donors, and things coming. I think it's just natural, and again, it's part of the nature of the job to be stressful, right? To be stressed, sorry. But those are external demands. Now, if you were thinking about it, you can have, with the stress, you can have similar physical reactions to anxiety, but the anxiety are more internal demands, in the sense that are the constructions of those potential scenarios. What if I don't handle the report? What if I don't have the information I need to receive the donors? What if I am not prepared for the interview enough? What if they ask me questions I don't know? There are, again, things that are in the future and things that are yet not there, and they're internal somehow. Okay, so what do we do with that then? I think first, distinguish what you're going through. Okay, so see, are you going through a situation of stress or a situation of anxiety. I think one other thing that I find really relevant to distinguish anxiety and stress is, okay, stress, if you get out of the environment, if they remove those pressures, okay, because you might be stressed about writing a proposal, right? Or because you are very stressed because your boss is demanding, I'm going to put it in a nice way, right? If this person is removed, you don't have that anxiety, you don't have that stress anymore. It means we're under stress, right? If in anxiety in general, what happens is one problem is replaced by other. You know, like I start thinking, okay, what if I don't do this interview well? Okay, right. But then maybe you pass the interviews. What if they haven't realized that I'm not that good enough? What if they ask me to do something I don't really know how to do? And then you keep on performing well, is that what if they ask me to take a further position? You know, so it's always finding a what if, you know, it's always looking for the, you know, what is the next worst scenario that is going to happen? And that's anxiety. Okay. Now, I was thinking, you know, when I was writing that, for me, resident or local staff were generally really good about dealing with the stress in some ways, but particularly I remember one case that we had a boss that was not, I'd say, the best one on the ranking, and I was talking about this with the local staff, and I was a bit worried, you know, I was like feeling uncomfortable and under pressure, and they were looking, I could see that they were quite relaxed, and they said, well, don't worry, Bea, you know what, in a year he will be gone. That's it. It's a stress, basically. In a year he will be gone. This person won't be here anymore. The stressor is gone. Okay, so that's I mean, that's what it is. That's the difference between stress and anxiety. Now, if we talk about stress, so about anxiety, I wrote here, how can you deal with your thoughts? So let's come back to all the questions we've posed. What is hooking you to anxiety? Is preparedness? Is it caring? Is it motivation? In which side of it are you? Are you over preparing? You know, all the things that we are mentioning today, right? Now, if it's a stress, I thought, okay, I would like to recommend these two books, because the stress obviously is another chapter, is another webinar. But I thought there were two things that could be done somehow, right? And one is setting boundaries. So I leave this here if you want to copy the book. So I don't know if you, I'm not very, let's say I'm not very fan of, very keen on self-help books, but this one's, I feel comfortable about recommending them. And I don't know any of the authors, so I don't get any commission for this recommendation, just for you to know. So this one, the one on setting boundaries, is very practical. It talks about difficulties we have sometimes to set boundaries. You know, the guilt, the fears, things of that kind. She's American. She has an American style when she writes, but I found practical. The second one is an Italian lady, and I find it beautiful in the sense that these 75 ways of avoiding burnt out are very much related to explaining what burnt is. It's more about reflections, I would say. The tools that she's given are generally books. I don't know if ever any of you have read any of these two, but this the Idealist Survival Kit is more referring to books and philosophical reflections, so it's less practical. It's very Italian in that sense. So she goes into the reflection part and the philosophical part, and the American goes to the practical side. So I thought it was interesting to have both of them here. So I'm afraid that's it. I'm very proud of myself. I did it in the time I thought I was going to do it. I hope this has been useful. And I hope you start reconsidering anxiety, maybe slightly in a different way than before.